You know, there's some things you learn as a pastor that are good news in people's lives, and there's some things you learn as a pastor that are tough things in people's lives. And one of the things that I've learned as a pastor is that about 90% of us carry around some sort of bitterness. Now, it's obvious when the bitterness is debilitating and overwhelming in such a way that people cease to function in everyday life. But for a lot of us, the bitterness actually seems manageable. It just pops up in our lives at different times. So it shows up as frustration when we feel like we should have overcome something already and we can't overcome it, or we've made a choice that we regret, but we continue to make that choice. It shows up as anger when someone's face or name comes to mind, or you cross them in the community and you remember something about the way that person treated you or your family that left a scar in you. It shows up as weakness when we're facing things and circumstances in life that we feel like we just can't overcome. This low-level bitterness that maybe we would just call the seeds or the root of bitterness is actually part of the story of a lot of our lives, and we carry it with us when we don't have to. Over the next 5 weeks, I'm going to describe to you a quality, a characteristic, an idea about God that I do not want you to miss. If you miss or you misunderstand this quality or characteristic about God, then I think you've actually missed the whole of what God and who God is about. And maybe the most succinct way to describe this quality and what happens when we don't embrace it comes from a single verse in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. This is what it says. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God. This is a commission to people like me and any of you who are leaders at Suncrest to say, hey, whenever you're talking about who God is, whenever you're describing Him, someone who doesn't know Him, maybe misunderstands Him, make sure that no one falls short, no one misses out on, no one fails to experience the grace of God. To me, it is the most beautiful and most powerful concept ever conceived in the mind of God. It is what takes the characteristic of love that is God and actually puts flesh on it in your life and my life. But if people miss out on it or fall short of the grace of God, then a bitter root tends to grow up in our lives. And so I think over the next 5 weeks, many of you, maybe all of you, will experience, if you let it, a new freedom that comes in an encounter with the grace of God. Now, what do I mean by grace? Well, theologians have explained it in many different ways. I'm going to give you a very simple definition here that I think is practical, and you'll see how it intersects your life. I'm not offering that this is the complete definition of grace, but I think this is a fair description of what grace does in our lives. Grace provides power when you don't have strength. Grace provides peace when you're marked by an internal chaos. Grace provides a pardon, a forgiveness, a cleansing, and a freedom when you carry your guilt. But grace doesn't provide those in a way that's mysterious. There's actually an activating factor that allows you and I to encounter and experience the grace of God, and that is when we understand that this grace is not within you. The power is not within you. The peace isn't naturally within you. The pardon is not a place where you can just forgive yourself for what you did. And I see two areas where people kind of come up short on this, and they kind of live on opposite ends of the spectrum. Some people know that they don't have the power or the peace or the ability to pardon themselves, but they also don't know that there's a God out there embodied in Jesus Christ who provides this to us. And they need to know and be invited to experience this God. Perhaps even more so, the people who miss out on the grace of God are people who are on what I call the self-reliance plan. Who know they need power and peace and pardon, but they think somehow they can conjure that up inside themselves, that they can just reach down inside and there will always be enough strength, or there will always be a peace, or there will be enough to forgive themselves. But it's not true until we actually come face to face with our own shortcomings, or our own lack of power and peace and pardon, and say, I need something that's not within me. That's when we encounter the grace of God. We're doing a 5-week study along with this 5-week series. In your groups, you're going to go through a book called Grace is Greater. It's written by a friend of mine named Kyle Idleman. And in the opening chapter of that book, he describes the idea and explanation of grace in this way. He says, grace is compelling when it's explained. You can explain it to some degree. You can give a definition of it. The Apostle Paul writes all about it in the New Testament. And when it's explained, there's enough logic lines that you can get your head around this. It's compelling. But actually explaining it falls short. Because grace is irresistible when it's experienced. And some of you can think back to the moment in your lives when you first experienced the overwhelming grace of God. It actually defies explanation, doesn't it? But when God's grace flooded in and you had a strength you didn't have before, you had a peace that wasn't present before, or you experienced forgiveness and mercy and grace for what you had done wrong, that's when we capture grace. And so I want to tell some stories this morning that get at God's grace. I want to start by just outlining the story of this in Jesus' life. Interestingly, Jesus himself never used the word grace. Paul, when he read the rest of the New Testament, would come back and explain what happened with grace. But Jesus actually just went by and lived out God's grace. And you see it in all the stories of his life. If we just follow the Gospel of John very quickly, you wouldn't be surprised that Jesus is introduced in the Gospel of John as the fullness of grace and truth. And then in the opening chapter of John the Apostle writes about a guy named John the Baptist who was Jesus' cousin and who was out leading people spiritually. Get this. He was leading people to a baptism of repentance. And that went something like this. People were able to acknowledge they had done things wrong. They would go through this kind of spiritual exercise where they would commit to doing better. Commit to doing better. I've been doing things wrong. I got to clean up my life. I got to do better. And after John was doing this baptism of repentance, he sees Jesus, literally sees him in the distance in the wilderness. And when he sees Jesus, he says, that man is something different. Look, the Lamb of God, who doesn't just help you get better, but who literally can take away your sin. He takes away the sin of the world. It's fascinating the encounters Jesus would have. In John chapter 3, he'd encounter a man named Nicodemus. They met over the cover of night, and Nicodemus was a real rule follower. He was someone who was pretty sure that he would get God's acceptance because he did all the right things, and Jesus gave him an entirely different message. He said, no, actually what you need is to be born again. To actually give up on handling all this yourself and experience a new life that only comes through giving up your life to God. This was tough for Nicodemus to square with himself. And so Jesus comes in with his single message of who God is. This is what he says. He says, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world. I don't know how you picture God, but if you picture God as up in heaven, watching out for someone to do something wrong so he can zap them, that is an inaccurate picture of God. God did not send Jesus into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world when we could not save ourselves. Fast forward to John chapter 4, and Jesus is having this wild encounter with a woman who's out drawing water at a well. The circumstances of the story help us understand how much this woman's life is just busted up. She's out there in the middle of the day. No one went to draw water in the middle of the day unless you didn't have any friends and you wanted to go at a time when you didn't have to be with anybody. When Jesus encountered her story, she probably anticipated that he would stand in judgment because we know she had been married 4 times already and the man she was living with now wasn't even her husband. But when she looks into the eyes of a man named Jesus, she experiences grace because he gives her a message. This is what he says. He says, everyone who drinks this water from this well, they'll be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst again. And she was so overwhelmed that she could experience something so transforming that she actually goes back into town and tells everyone, even the people who have not been her friends, about her encounter with Jesus. Fast forward to John chapter 8, there's a woman who's been caught in the act of adultery. Now, maybe we shouldn't be surprised these days, but when there's an act of adultery, of course it includes 2 people. Somehow the guy got to exit and the woman was drug out into the center of the town square. And there are all the teachers of the law, the religious leaders who are ready to stone her because the law, according to the Old Testament, said adultery is a capital offense. And they asked Jesus, what should we do with this woman? You know what the law says. And here's what Jesus says. He says, I'll tell you what. How about any of you who are living lives that are perfect without sin? Go for it. Kill her. But maybe we should all do a little internal reflection. This story actually tells us that Jesus gets down in the ground. He's in sand or dirt. He's writing something in the dirt. We don't know what he wrote, but whatever it was, it caused one by one those judgmental men to drop their rocks and walk away. She was left with Jesus alone with a grace encounter. She's wondering if he will condemn her. And he said, did they condemn you? No. Then neither do I condemn you. Now, go and leave your life of sin. He was not saying to her, go try harder. He was saying, it's time to walk into a new life where you're not relying on yourselves and you're not relying on your old ways, but you've encountered me. There's a grace that's unconditional and it's free. Chapter later in John chapter 9, Jesus heals a man who had been born blind and lived up into his adult life with his blindness. When Jesus heals this man, the idea that he had been totally blind for his whole life completely changed, and now he could see. And religious authorities come around and try to investigate. They're kind of upset that Jesus was doing these things. And so they questioned this man about what happened. I love this guy's answer when they questioned him. Here's what he says. He says, whether Jesus is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind. Now I see. And for some of you today, for some of you, it'll take all 5 weeks of this series. This could be your story. I was blind, but now I see. I was broken. Now I'm whole. I was guilty, but now I'm forgiven. I was wounded, but now I'm healed. And it's a single encounter with the grace of God in the person of Jesus Christ where you give up fixing it yourself. That you have these encounters that are transforming. Jesus would go on to have a conversation with his disciples in the upper room. This is the night before he went to the cross. He's with his closest friends, one of whom would betray him. But he's having a conversation with them about how they're going to handle this once he's gone. And he says to them, listen, you got to remain in me, and I will remain in you. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And then he went to the garden and prayed. He was arrested. He was put on trial. He was beaten. He was flogged. He was laid out on a Roman cross and literally had his hands and feet nailed to that cross. They dropped it into the ground. And while Jesus is hanging on the cross, the grace of God is everywhere. He's got a thief on each side. And on one side, the thief says, I'm on the self-reliance plan. And the other thief says, I need your mercy. And the one who's humble enough to say, I need your mercy, Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. He looks down at the very people who are mocking him, who are spitting at him, and he says, Father, forgive them. They don't even know what they're doing. And then the earth rumbles and darkness comes over the land, and Jesus breathes his last, and he lets out this phrase, it is finished. It's such a powerful phrase because the literal and physical darkness that had come over the land is only an image of your darkness and mine, your brokenness and mine, your sinfulness and mine, your weakness and mine. That was all thrust upon Jesus in that moment, and if we let him have it instead of being on the self-reliant plan, Jesus says that all can be over. It is finished. Now, I have more stories for you this morning, but I want to pause before I tell these stories and invite you simply to encounter the grace of God that was present on the cross. A few weeks ago, I made some phone calls to a few people in our church who represent a large number of people in our church who have encountered the grace of God. And I asked them if they would be willing for me to tell their stories this morning. And with great candor, and I think with great bravery, these friends of mine agreed to do so. And so I want you to hear their stories, because the way I imagine it, their stories are in many ways your story. This is my friend Aaron. I've known Aaron for quite a while now. I got the chance to perform his wedding a number of years ago and see his family grow. But when Aaron was in high school, he started a habit that would become defining for the next 20 years of his life. He was engaged with pornography. Like most guys or women engaged in pornography, it starts as dabbling in something, and then it hooks you a little bit, and then you think you could manage it, that you could quit at any time, and nobody wants to call it an addiction. But after Aaron had tried for years, managing it, telling himself he could stop, stopping for a few days and going right back to it, at some point it was correct to call it an addiction. He had meaningful relationships in his life. There's probably a picture that when he got married, this would stop, but he got married and it didn't stop. And a picture that when he had kids, it would stop, but he had kids and it didn't stop. And the lying and the hiding and the cleaning up and all of that just leads to guilt. Guilt. He would get caught by his wife. And he would say that he was sorry. But he was really just sorry that he got caught. And he'd get mad at her for catching him, and then he'd go back and do it all over again. And she was patient with him, very patient with him. But about 10 years ago, she caught him again. This time, she kicked him out. Things were on the path to divorce. When through the grace of God, his wife came to him and said, "We got to put God at the center of this." And Aaron described the moment to me, the moment where you have to kind of lay everything down and say, "I've tried to fight it, I've tried to manage it, I thought I could handle it. Clearly I can't. I need something I don't have." And in that moment, the grace of God rushed in. It put relationships around him, it put wisdom around him, and it gave him a freedom and a liberation from pornography. And for 10 years, Aaron's been clean. Aaron's a picture of someone who is guilty. But God's grace is greater. This is my friend Becky. If you were here last week, you heard me tell a story that we had a family in our community group at Suncrest whose teenage son died this past spring, but that wasn't really the whole story. Becky's son, Sam, had fought for many years with what he called shadows of darkness. And there would be times where for days or even weeks he would not get out of bed. There was a depression, there was a mental illness, and they sought out counseling, clinical help. And Sam couldn't overcome it. And on March 12th of this year, Sam took his own life in their home. Becky told me that the pain of childbirth is nothing compared to seeing your own son lay in his casket. When we sat down to plan the funeral, Becky's husband Kevin said he was so fragile. And I just thought, aren't we all? But in the most debilitating moments of Becky's life, God's grace rushed in. Sometimes God's grace were the people he sent to sob with her when she couldn't control it laying on the ground.
Some pictures of God's grace were the people he sent into her home to clean up the room where sin had done this. Sometimes it was the community that she shared, her church family that walked with her, a dance team from Lake Central High School that poured in. God's grace was there. I sat down with Becky this past July, and honestly, in that conversation, she was to me a picture of someone who had given up trying to handle this herself. And instead of being angry at God, allowed God's peace to take a place instead of the guilt. I said to her that day when we were sitting down, you are a picture of what the Apostle Paul describes when he says, the message of Jesus to him, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. And so today, with the peace that Sam is with God, with the strength that her marriage and her relationship with other kids have actually become stronger in the midst of this, Becky is a picture of where there was weakness, but God's grace is great. This is my friend Curtis. 2.5 years ago, Curtis and his then fiance were kind of flying high on life. On the path to marriage, they had been together for some time. They did not believe in God, either one of them. And then Curtis made some really dumb decisions to engage in a relationship with his fiance's best friend. Sent texts that are inappropriate. Danielle found out. Everything collapsed around him. The wedding was off. And a few months later, Curtis just bolted. To hear him describe it was a running, searching, chasing for something that would make him feel happy, but what ended up as a downward spiral. And there's a lot of elements to this story, but maybe the defining one was the moment he's sitting in a bar in Chicago and sitting there looking up saying, God, how did I end up here? In the meantime, the woman who had been his fiancée made her way to Suncrest. Started having encounters with the God of the universe that were real and transforming and powerful. And even though she still had a lot of anger toward Curtis, she wanted him to experience what she had experienced. And so she invited him here. There's, of course, some resistance at first, but then there's always that moment. If you're looking up and say, God, how did I end up here? It says, God, if you're real, I need what she's experienced. Curtis came here, and as you might imagine, the relationship did not heal immediately. Over time, the grace of God continued to rush in. Forgiveness was given and granted. And just last fall, Curtis and Danielle were married. It's a family that's been put back together again. Children that are being raised together again. And in the midst of all this brokenness, Curtis learned that God's grace is greater. This is my friend Sulie. I've been at Suncrest for 22 years, and I've shared all 22 of them with Sulie. She and her husband, after they just knew me for 6 months, made a 5-hour drive to come and celebrate my ordination in the ministry with me. Her husband was a leader here, an elder, in fact. And then on a year where he had stepped out of leadership, he was unfaithful to Sulie. They called me. I went over to their house. I sat in their living room. We prayed. We talked. We decided we were going to fight. And there's a recommitment to forgive and move forward with a marriage. only months later, he cheated on her again. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation, but all the feelings that come with someone who's been unfaithful to you start to make you question things about yourself, about who you are, about why this would happen. And all those feelings were there for Susan. It was a season in her life, this is 10 years ago, where she sought counsel. She was surrounded by great friends, but ultimately, she tells me, that it was finding that her identity was in Christ, not in her marriage, that gave her the freedom to move forward. It's not easy to move forward because there's all kinds of dreams that have been shattered, and you're raising a child together, and you know all the pain and the hurt and the bitterness that can come up through this. But I've seen this woman walk over the last 10 years, a journey of God's grace. Within this past year, two things have happened with Sue Lynn. About this time last year, we were all in this room, and this room was under construction. We had torn up the old carpet that was in here, and underneath that carpet were people who had signed this floor when we first built this building. I was standing right in the back of the room, back there, very near Sue Lynn, when I saw her look down. She saw her ex-husband's name. And all the feelings just rushed back in. And she kind of collapsed into me that day, and we cried, and we prayed, and we remembered God is faithful. And then on December 17th of last year, in the Christmas service, we were having a conversation here about peacemaking. And she decided on that day it was finally time to make her peace with her ex-husband. And so she sent him a text that day. She actually asked for his forgiveness for her part in the deterioration of their marriage. And she told him that she forgives him. And we talked about that. She said, he didn't text me back. And that's okay. I didn't expect him to text him back. And I didn't text him so he would text me back. This was about me forgiving him and experiencing the fullness of the grace of God. See, Sue Lee, a life that was wounded, but God's grace is greater. This is the power of God, my friends. That when you step off of the I can manage it, I can handle it, I'll be strong enough path, and you encounter the God of the universe who wants to pour his love and his unconditional grace into your life, it shows up as power, and it shows up as peace, and it shows up as a pardon that you can't give yourself. This is the grace of God. Would you join me in thanking God and praying to God right now? Heavenly Father, your goodness is on display. The power of a changed life, a changed heart, a changed mind, just the transformation that you want us to step into. And I thank you, God, for people who are bold enough to step into it. And I thank you that you met them right where they were. God, we love you because you first loved us.